All right. We are slightly ready to go.
Yep. So anyway, people are trickling in. Thank you so much for being, all of you lovely people who followed us over here. We really appreciate it. And so sorry about this. Apparently YouTube hates us today. Not that that ever happens, but feel free to put stuff right into the chat window here if you've got any questions or any comments, or if you just want to say hi, and we're going to go ahead and get started. So I think, let's see, I think you're gonna
I'll start off.
Get us rolling, Tracy.
So if you've never been to Nerdy Shop Talk before, this is an initiative that Julie and I started, because when we attend a lot of different events, the thing that we really enjoy the most is when we're sitting around a table, just more impromptu kind of idea, and talking to people about different subjects, different things that they are maybe experts in and we're not experts in, or we have a little bit of knowledge about, and just kind of getting the group mindset from everyone about what they think about a particular topic. So I'm going to ask, if you're not one of our guests, maybe you can mute your microphone, because what happens is if you make any noise, the camera flips to you. So if you could just do that for us, that would be fantastic. So that is what we are about here. Julie, if you have not met Julie before, and I certainly hope you have, she's an instructional designer, the author of Design for How People Learn, which is one of the best-selling e-learning authoring instructional design books that are out there. She's also a respected international speaker and instructor, and has been recognized as a guild master with the e-learning guild.
Yeah, and my co-host is Tracy Parish, and Tracy's just one of those people who gets things done. She's an educational technology specialist, and she does all of the parts and pieces, which will actually be relevant to this conversation today in terms of instructional design, project management, development. She's a frequent speaker at industry and events, and one of our articulate community heroes, and a moderator at LearnChat. And she shares a bunch of free e-learning resources at her website. So yeah, so we're going to go ahead and get started.
Thanks. So you'll notice that Julie and I might be looking off screen a lot. We are trying to capture notes. We're monitoring chat. So if you see us looking around, it's not that we're doing extra work. We're doing work for this. So today's topic, we're talking about visual design for learning, and we want to go beyond the thought of the idea that we just put visual design in things just to make it pretty. So is it we want to talk about the responsibilities of the instructional designer, how we use our graphic design, what kind of skills we need to do that, how important really is it for what we're creating, and what kind of mastery or skill level do we need to be or to use visual design. And our guests we have today on my screen from left to right is Bianca Woods, Connie Malamed, and Tom Kuhlmann.
Yeah, and so when we were talking about who we wanted to have here, these were the people who jumped to mind. Connie's done all sorts of wonderful writing about visual design for learning, including books. She's written books about this topic. And Tom has done an enormous amount of stuff on the Articulate blog about how to improve the visual design of e-learning work. And I think you've probably done more single-handedly to improve the look of most of the e-learning that's out there in the world than any other individual possibly. And then Bianca just makes really delightful, lovely things and helps other people make delightful, lovely things. So those were the reasons we wanted to have these particular folks here for this topic.
Now, why can't I see Bianca? Oh, there she is. She popped up again.
I'm hiding.
Yeah, she's hiding today. So thank you everyone for joining us today. So we want to start off with the notion or the idea about what is it? Technical difficulties today are just abound.
Yeah, everybody who followed us here, you guys are heroes for just showing up. Thank you so much.
Showing up.
Really.
And watch us struggle through here. So let's start with what you each think. What are kind of the instructional design skills that you think, or the visual design skills that you think instructional designers need? And one of the reasons this came up to us, or is very important to us, is the recent article by Jane Bozarth in Learning Solutions Mag, where it's now or it's more common that as instructional designers, we are wearing a dozen, 24 different hats. We're graphic artists. They want us to do VR, the AR. We have
Hey,
to
Tracy.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm totally going to interrupt you and ask you if we've hit the record button.
Yes, we have.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Go for us.
Yeah, so we just want to know what you kind of think, what do we need to actually, what kind of skills do we need? How proficient do we need to be in those skills?
I think a lot of it has to do, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of it has to do with the size of the team that you're on. Because if you're on a large team, there are some companies where you're not even allowed to have Photoshop on your computer because they only want graphic designers, full-time graphic designers to do the graphics. That's one extreme. And then the other extreme is someone who's working alone. So I think you have to find something kind of in the middle if you're maybe just starting out, and that would be at least understanding the principles of visual design so that you can speak with a graphic designer, talk to someone, and know from the perspective of learning what works. So I think that's kind of your basics.
Yeah, I would say, when you build courses, I always say you kind of have these three legs to that, right? So the first is your content and everything that goes into that. Second one is always what the look and feel of the course is, and the third part is around the interactivity, or what should people do in the course or with the course. And in all the workshops we've done, that second leg, the what it should look and feel like, that's like the biggest gap, I think, for most people that are building courses. And I think it goes to what Connie was talking about is, you do have this range of teams. And from my experience, most of probably because I work at Articulate, most of the people we meet are like 1 or 2 person type teams. And so in that world, they really are wearing all hats, right? So they're doing everything. And so if you're in that world, you probably need to know a lot more than the person who's just an instructional designer and works with the team of people. I think the hurricane hit. So anyway, there is a range, right? I think in a general sense, if I was thinking about my career, the more you know about that, the better better equipped you are, and probably more hireable, or at least hireable at a better wage.
I'd say from a universal perspective, because I think you both brought up the idea that depending on where you work, what you're going to have to do on a day-to-day basis could range wildly. If you're looking for a baseline that'll work no matter where you are, I think looking at graphic design techniques that help you simplify things, that help you reduce content, leverage graphics so that you can reduce text, reduce confusion in your design through good layout choices. Those are your baseline that even if you're someone who doesn't feel incredibly comfortable with visual design or art, they're easy skills to learn, and they make this huge difference in the look and feel of what you create, and also reduce cognitive overload, which, those of us in learning and development, we love that.
Yeah, I mean, you could just say simplify everything, and that would be a great principle.
Simplify, but don't simplify until it gets confusing. And that's the hard line to learn, because we always talk about simplify your visual design, and then sometimes you'll see things where people simplified it so much that they've forgotten components, or they don't realize, well, you know what everything is, but the person who's seeing this for the first time doesn't.
Right. Anybody? I was just wondering if anyone in the chat had anything to say about that.
Yeah, we're always happy to have kind of follow-up questions and things like that in the chat if anybody's got a comment about it. So it sounds like we're sort of saying that there's, possibly the making things really visually stunning is probably out of reach, but that we would say a minimum skill level might be, the ability to do something clean and straightforward and that's sort of easy for people to follow and understand. Is that anybody want to dispute that or clarify what I just said?
Well, that's a good one, but also it's so interesting how being able to speak to graphic designers if you're on a big team is so important, because a lot of times they could come from an advertising or marketing background, and they don't understand as well as you do how people learn. And so there has to be some balance there between educating them about how people learn, and perhaps the professional designers educating maybe an instructional designer on palette choices or something like that.
So maybe even if you don't know how to create instructional design or create visual design, at least being able to speak the language with them, you mean?
Yeah, like you could say, oh, that graphic. I wrote an article several years ago about the terms that visual designers, that instruction designers should know. And it's things like being able to say to a graphic designer, I think like just a little bit more vibrancy or a little more saturation, would be good for that. Or actually the palette that they say that we have to use, it would be very bad for learning. It's just too many bright colors. That would be hard to look at 25 screens with those brilliant colors. So, just being able to speak their language and educate them, find a nice middle ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also, there are basic skills, right? Basic things. You may not be a proficient graphic designer, but there are basic things you should know: composition, layout, how to, scanning pages, changing your headers. There are some core things. I think the good thing over the last, 10 years or so, years ago, right? You kind of either, if you didn't have a graphic designer, you're fumbling around ungrouping clip art and all that type of stuff, right? That people kind of all started with. But today, how much do you need to know about composition? Where 10 years ago everything was a blank slide and you kind of had to do everything. And today you have templates and there's all sorts of resources available that people didn't have. That you could create a layout and the composition for any possible type of course you're building, right? You can have thousands of different types of layouts. And so you have all these templates, you have a lot of these assets available to you that you didn't have before. But when you look at the asset, you still need to know, how do I make this look right? Or it does this look right or appropriate to what I'm doing? It's kind of like the, people who design, I was going to say design houses, but those are architects. But those people who come in with their pillows and the cloth swatches and the colors and stuff like that, the home designers, right? They come in and they kind of know, they can look at a room and know what they need to do in the room. And I think in the same sense, in a person who designs courses, even if you're not the graphics person, you should be able to come into the room and kind of get a sense of what needs to happen in the room, even if you don't necessarily have the skills to do that.
I'll say a big change, and this is one that's huge for me as a former art teacher, is when I first started teaching, there wasn't YouTube. And YouTube is amazing if you are someone who is super uncomfortable with design and you're just looking for the basics and someone to walk you through it, because you can find short little videos that teach you about how do I do a color palette, or how do I think about alignment. And it's just, you invest a few minutes and it'll give you, not a graphic designer's level of experience with that, but enough where you can start taking on the basics yourself with, some comfort.
Yeah, it's almost a matter of a couple of things that you touched on there is making your own little resource of tools, templates, and instructional videos or instructional, even if it's an instructional site that helps you create your content. And as you go, I can't think it was Connie that said, no, I believe it was Bianca that said things that you can repurpose and use over and over. So here's a tip how I make a color palette. Keep that somewhere, keep that as a bookmark so you can go back to it and repurpose it over and over as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
we just lost Tracy.
Oh. No,
she's there.
There she is. Yeah, Tracy's
Yeah, it's just when somebody joins us and their microphone's on, sometimes that'll take the image away. That's okay.
Okay. Yep. And just a reminder, if anybody hasn't done it already, if you can mute yourself when you come in, that would be swell. Yeah. So what's a reasonable expectation if somebody's, applying for a job as an instructional designer? I mean, does it, I think Bianca kind of explained that sort of a certain amount of making things, being able to kind of make things look clean and reasonable is kind of a minimum requirement. And obviously different jobs have different requirements. I mean, some people are instructional designers who never do any kind of development as in like an e-learning or anything like that. And then there's others who, the expectation is clear from the job description that you're going to need to be able to do kind of all of the pieces. So I guess the question is, and I think one of the ones I've heard is sort of the ability to make use of resources in some kind of reasonable way to do some of the basic stuff. I'm thinking of somebody who's like maybe looking for a job. What should they expect to need to have or to need to be able to do? There's also a certain amount of kind of visual literacy that's different than, which I think Connie, you were getting at a little bit when you were talking about being able to talk to an actual designer, things like that. Anything else that somebody who's getting started as an instructional designer should have to have, or anything that we think is a reasonable expectation?
It takes a long time to get good or to feel comfortable with Photoshop. I notice a lot of instructional designers have gotten there, but maybe just even using, being able to use some graphic editor, even if it's PowerPoint as your graphic editor, which, it's gotten a lot more powerful over the years. There's Photoshop Elements, which is simpler. And then there are all those free tools like Canva and other ones that are easier to use. That seems to be like a nice thing to be able to tell, if you were on a job interview, that you do know and that you are a little bit experienced with using a graphic editor. Just being able to crop photos, change their lightness and contrast, just a few things like that I think can be helpful. Anybody else?
I think if you're out applying for work, I always tell people, one is you should always have a portfolio of different types of work examples. But, I always say you can be an instructional designer, but people are going to look at your portfolio and they're going to be drawn to what looks good or looks interesting more so than all your conversation about instructional design. So I think if you don't have any skills, at least be able to go find something that looks good and try to replicate it and make what you do when you're out looking for work look good, right? Because I think that is a key component when you're out looking for work. But, it still really just depends on what type of work you're looking for and what role is being hired. If you're being hired as an instructional designer, that's not necessarily the same as a person who's, I would say, is a course author who's going to use a storyline or one of those tools and construct the course, right? Because the course construction, and then you're probably having to do a lot of the graphics. But if you're just a pure instructional designer, then your need for some graphics experience is probably less than if you are really being hired to be a course author and you're building courses. So I think that's probably one distinction to consider, but, just a general understanding. And I think being able to at least take a nice looking vector graphic and decompile it and make that into a template. And so you have something that's consistent and clean and looks good, I think is a viable skill.
I think, and you brought up the idea of, are you a pure instructional designer or are you actually going to be authoring courses? If you're a pure instructional designer, I think the competency you really want to have is something that Connie brought up, the fluency with some of the terms, because you might not be actually doing the visual design, but you need to be able to talk confidently about what your vision is with the person who will end up doing the design. So understanding some design terms so you can have collaboration where you actually get what you want, that's your baseline. If you're doing course design, let's say you're doing something in Storyline or Captivate, and you might be like soup to nuts, you're doing the whole thing. Basic design skills with layout, color choice, and sensible typography. And a lot of that is like I was talking about earlier, just keeping things really, really simple. Things like with typography, don't use 15 different fonts, use 1 or 2. It's really safe. It always looks good. Don't put tons of different images on your screen if you don't need them. 1 good image is way better than 16 little ones. But it's almost, if you're just trying to get comfortable, getting fluent with using PowerPoint in aesthetically pleasing and visually helpful ways is a really good baby step. A lot of the skills that you'll build in PowerPoint are easy to use in that software, and then we'll transfer over to things like Articulate and Captivate. And then if you start getting even more skilled, some of that transfers over even into things like Photoshop. But it's a good baby step. It's something that almost all of us have at work, so it's a great place to practice.
Mm-hmm.
So, Julie mentioned about visual literacy. Have you, I know each of you have dealt with people from all sorts of different countries. Tom, you were recently over in Europe doing training. Have you experienced issues with visual literacy and ideas where, you know, the way we portray something or an icon here, have you come across where it just doesn't translate somewhere else that you've gone to? Like, I think that's important to know too, right?
We hear that quite a bit, you know, in our workshops. I think we did a workshop in London one time, and I was speaking to somebody, I think they were from one of the Scandinavian countries, and they were saying that the American courses looked too American. And so it's like, well, what does that mean, right? Because the ones we were showing, I thought looked pretty nice. And so I was like, well, why doesn't that work for you? And so she showed me something they were working on, and it was very like Scandinavian, right? It was kind of lighter grays, you know, all that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And so there was definitely a cultural visual that or something that works for them, right? And I think, you know, David shares in some of the workshops that, you know, he does this kind of has developed this whole design mapping activity, and part of that process is to root that stuff out. And, you know, he's shared where, you know, he's worked with customers and they've come back and said, well, you know, these characters that you put in this design map, they look too American. And so you do get that. I mean, we see that, you know, and Articulate with the character packs that, you know, every culture, they want something that's unique to their culture and stuff. And so so those are things that you have to deal with, the way icons are used or graphics are used, just, you know, how subtle or how brash things may be. You know, I think Americans, we tend to kind of design a lot of game-like looking courses, right? They're really bright and bold and a lot of stuff in them. And then you go to other places and maybe a little bit more subdued. But I think those are things that, you know, you have to consider as well if you have an international audience.
Also, I have learned that there are certain icons I can't use for international audiences. They're apparently rude gestures, so I can
like that middle finger one.
Yeah, I don't know why they don't like the middle finger. I haven't been able to figure that one out. I would say that I no longer use thumbs up and thumbs down, which is really a bummer, because I really like that one. And yeah, there are a few other ones that I was told I cannot use because they are rude gestures. So that's been a pretty big, you know, now they're completely not part of my visual vocabulary anymore. I can't take a chance. You know, the people where they live, or it's pretty fluid. You can meet people from other countries wherever you go, and you don't want to insult them. So that's a big thing.
Alan, go ahead, Bianca.
Oh, so some of this isn't even at whether you're dealing within your country that you live in or not, too, because different audiences are going to have different familiarity with icons, with analogies, different comfort levels with more, I'd say, quote unquote, modern designs versus more traditional designs. I mean, I used to work for a bank, and depending on what area of the bank you were working with, some of them wanted it to look very old school. not necessarily in an ugly way, but very, very formal. And other ones were other areas of the bank were very comfortable with a more modern look or a more game-like look, depending on who you were designing for. Legal really liked traditional looks. Who would guess? But frontline employees were pretty comfortable with more modern approaches. So it really is a lot of just get to know who you're designing for, because good design isn't universal.
Yeah. And it's tricky. When I just got an echo. Are you hearing an echo?
Yep.
I hate that. Let me unplug again.
No, you're good.
I'll try that again. Can you hear me now? Anyway, it's tricky because almost any audience can be an international audience. So a lot of times you just don't know. So I'm always trying to play it safe. But I'm really glad about I'm teaching a visual design course in Europe, and I guess I didn't realize that that in the Scandinavian countries it might be a more subtle. I mean, I do know Scandinavian design, so yeah, it's really clean and beautiful. Good to know.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things, as you are each mentioning, it's kind of something, it's hard to even know until somebody points it out to you somewhere else, because obviously we're so diverse. Somebody's pointing out IKEA. Just think of IKEA design when you're making something. Yeah, I think it's hard for us to know what's going to be maybe taken offensive or taken the wrong way until it's pointed out to us sometimes. It's hard to find a comprehensive visual design encyclopedia for the whole world.
Yeah.
But Connie, there's your next book.
Okay, I got it. Oh, it's done.
Perfect.
All right,
3
great.
pages. Perfect.
So
Anything.
at the workshops we do, kind of reference David's design map activity again. You know, we talk a lot about intentional design, and you know, people. I think I did a blog post on this a while back, but I was working on some idea, and then it wasn't completely fleshed out. Then I went to iStock and was looking for graphics because I was going to do something, and I wanted like a Polaroid look or something. So I was actually looking for a picture of family frames or something, and so I was looking for that. Next thing I found this picture, and I thought, oh, you know, maybe it was like this Polaroid type effect. And I thought, well, maybe this will work. And so I was going there. And the next thing I know, I spent like 4 or 5 hours bookmarking images and playing around with all these pictures. And so I used that to kind of talk about the intentionality of the design, that, you know, you really shouldn't just start building your course and then start putting stuff in there, right? You should really be intentional about what you're doing. Especially on the graphics side. And the graphics side, for the person who has to wear all hats and has to build the courses, really is kind of a challenging part of the job. So we do this design mapping activity to kind of help create the intentionality. So David's kind of pioneered that over the last 10, 15 years or so. And what we do in the activity, one of the things we do is you start to identify, you know, you kind of describe first what you want, and then it's just like a mind brain dump, right? You just throw a bunch of stuff out there, and somewhere in the process you start to filter that, and you come up with the right type of look and feel for your content. So then when you do start to assemble your course, you've at least got some intention about what you need. So if you're speaking to excuse me, if you're speaking to a graphics person, you're able to articulate to them what you want. And if you're doing it yourself, you're not on iStock spending 5 hours looking for stuff. You're kind of more deliberate about what you're looking for. And that kind of helps guide the development. And in those conversations, I think that's the one I was referencing with David, when you work with a customer, you're able to say, here's what I came up with going through this process, and this is what we're thinking about doing. And at that point, you know, your client or your manager, whoever you're working for, they always have a mental picture of what they want. And they don't necessarily always know what they want until they see what you did, and then they realize what you did is what they don't want, right? And that's just part of working with people, right? And so, you know, that being intentional and kind of doing a lot of that stuff up front with this type of activities, it helps you clarify what you're looking for and how you want to design things, but it also helps clarify how you communicate with others, and also how you can solicit feedback from your client or manager, whoever you're working for on the project, so that you can get them to articulate what they're thinking and what their expectations are. The last thing you want to do is build a bunch of stuff and then, you know, have them come back and say, well, we don't like the look of this, or you're using the wrong characters, or too many colors, or all that type of stuff.
You know,
Yeah.
that communication thing sounds like a competency. That ability to communicate and express a design, prototype a design, get feedback, reiterate. That sounds like a real competency that would be good to list as part of your visual design competency. Julie, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I remember we used to really struggle with, we would do rough prototypes that had no visual treatments really at all. And people had such a hard time with that. They just wanted to tell us they didn't like the fonts. And we were like, no, we just want you to focus on the interactivity, because we would do these, kind of quick and dirty prototypes. But the nice thing about that is then the design conversation about look and feel stuff could happen separately. And we could put like a few different options in front of them to get feedback to, and then we could start to narrow down what they liked. And if they could give us a starting point, either branding guidelines or something that they already liked, that those sorts of things were really super helpful in terms of being able to narrow down a design direction that they would be happy with.
So you're saying separate it, possibly. One is the interactivity, and then the other is the design. Yeah, that's a good idea too.
Yeah, we always used to do that way back in the day when I was doing a lot of starting projects. We would do kind of these very rough and pretty deliberately scruffy prototypes of just the interactive elements, and then side by side do a visual treatment, and then bring them together for a more finished prototype or the final course or things like that. Mm-hmm. I also want to flag a couple of nice things that are going on in the comments. There was some discussion of representation. And so the issue of making sure that there's good sort of diversity represented in your pictures. And somebody also brought up the issue of kind of taking your own pictures so that it actually looks like your settings and your employees and some of those kinds of things. I think we've got a good, a couple of good references on the diversity stuff, so we'll put those in the show notes. So when the question I wanted to make sure we stuck in, by the way, we're kind of aiming to be done on the half hour, but can people stick around a little bit longer, or do you have a hard stop?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so apologies for the late start. That was entirely on YouTube. Let's blame them. But so the next question I wanted to kind of get out there was the issue of like, when is it worth really investing in the visual design? Like, I mean, always you want it to look good and clean and kind of what Bianca was talking about earlier, but like, are there times where, you think there's much more to be gained from a significant investment in visual design, or times when it's more important to bring in a professional or things like that?
I'll jump in if that's okay. I think one of the times where you have to really maybe invest more in your visual design is if it's going external to customers, because it's a combination piece then of learning or support as well as marketing. And so people's expectations of what that is tends to be a little higher on average. There's always going to be exceptions to that, but that is one place where it's worth spending the extra money. I think also just be cognizant of your own limitations as a designer, which are going to change as you start building your skills. But if you're really sensitive to what your strengths are as a visual designer and what they aren't, that can help flag when you need to ask someone else for help to get the level of what you need at the appropriate place.
Yeah, good points. Also, even though illustration is different than graphic design, I've known graphic designers, many of them in fact, who cannot illustrate. I will always hire an illustrator when I need some really good illustrations. I can kind of make one thing, but there's no way I would take on a full illustration job. I mean, professional illustrators, and I found reasonable ones on Upwork or Behance, are just, really amazing. They don't have to look at something to draw it. So that's another time when I will use someone outside of myself.
Yeah, I think, again, if we're talking about e-learning, right, or I guess instructional design, maybe we're not talking about e-learning, but you're building learning content, right? So you're building a learning experience, and so I would say stepping away from all that nonsense compliance training that has nothing to do with real learning and all that type of stuff, right? But if let's say you're actually doing something where people have to learn something and change a behavior, or be able to apply what they're learning. The first thing I would lean on is the interactive component, because if you build something that's meaningful and has the appropriate type of activity or interactions to it, you don't need to rely as heavily on the graphics if you've designed an interaction that works right. And so you can get away with it. And I'll post a link. One of the things I show, and this probably got to be almost 30 years old. I'll post it in the chat for people to look at. But this is what I use all the time in workshops, because it's just text. It's this first aid demo. Many of you probably already seen that. For those of you who are younger, it's vintage e-learning. But it's just text. There's no graphics to it, but it's a really nice, compelling little piece, based on what they're trying to teach you. So I would say, if you're building e-learning, if you build the right type of interactivity, the graphics probably aren't quite as you're not as dependent on them. Then going on the flip side, if you're building a lot of compliance training, I remember one time I was at a conference, we were chatting with somebody, and they made some comment about all these over-decorated e-learning courses and all that type of stuff, all the bling in the e-learning courses. And I said, well, if you're building bad e-learning, I'd rather have good-looking bad e-learning than bad-looking bad e-learning, because you're forcing people to go through this stuff, right? I mean, they don't have any control a lot of times. So why not make it aesthetically pleasing? And sometimes the aesthetic does engage people, right? They say, hey, this looks really slick. It might not be anything more than decorative content, but it's still, there's an aesthetic to having something that looks good, rather than, the 20, 30-year-old clip art things slapped on a PowerPoint slide. So I think there, some extremes to that. So if it's really good interactivity, you maybe don't need as many graphics. And if you have something where it's really not that interactive and it's really just a lot of content, and then maybe, leaning on some of the graphics to create a nice looking part of that is an important part too.
I think you also have to really think about the content, because I'm getting the echo now.
Unplug and put it back in.
Yeah. There are a lot of times when graphics can take on some or all of the work of communicating content, and that it's easier for someone to wrap their heads around something if they have a graphic as an accompaniment, or the content is shown directly through graphics. So, some content is amazing in text. And I mean, we've had separate conversations where text can still be incredibly immersive as it is. But if you're at a point where the content you have is going to be deeply helped with graphics, if you can't understand the content without some graphics with it, you do have to be aware of, are the quality of the graphics I have clearly communicating what I need people to take away with? And sometimes you can have a really simple graphic, and it's not hard to communicate or hard to create, even if you don't think of yourself as an artist, and it still gets the point across. Other times, like if you're doing, let's say, training on first aid, and you need to show people where a vein is, you don't want to do that kind of vaguely. You need a lot of technical skill to depict that appropriately. Then you're probably going to want to invest in your graphics.
Yeah, Tom, I think you do. I mean, I guess it really does depend on the content. I agree with Bianca. There could be explanations, something that's really abstract where you need to make it more concrete. So I think it depends on the content. What about when you teach ballroom dancing? Don't you think you need graphics then?
Maybe.
I am never teaching ballroom dancing, Connie. You do not want that.
I think there's a lot of studies that talk about the impact that seeing things versus reading things has. So I think there's a place to have graphics that do support your learning too, right? So you can consolidate a lot of what you might have to write in what you do with your graphics. Again, it goes back to who can design those things. Are you the one designing them, or is somebody else designing them?
By the way, I'll just mention, if anybody's got a particular question for our panel, feel free to put it in the chat. Go ahead, Connie.
There's been a lot of them. There's been a lot of good ones there. One was about educating. Oh, I know what it was. It was about how do you educate your manager or sponsors, I forget who it was, that visual design is something you do like from the start. It's not something that you put a little polish on at the end. And I was just saying that I just thought there was research to really support the importance of, aesthetic design or the use of graphics, relevant graphics, as Ruth Clark always emphasizes. So that maybe just education can help.
I did a lot of work with examples.
That's a good idea.
A project I was working on many years ago, we wanted to move an instructor over from overly complicated PowerPoints to ebooks as takeaways so we could simplify her PowerPoints. And she had no idea what the heck I was talking about. And she didn't really see the value of investing time and energy in this thing. She's like, it could just go on the PowerPoints. And then we showed her original PowerPoints, and then we showed her what the two documents separate from each other. So the simplified PowerPoints and then the ebooks. And just seeing examples of, if you change it, here's why it can be better. She really, really quickly understood. Like, I could have shown her research about ebooks do 20% more, blah, 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 blah. It wouldn't have mattered. But seeing examples made a huge difference, and she got on board right away.
That's really cool. Well, now this person, I think it might have been Jenny, was saying that they're into using design, but that it's something, that should just be polish at the end. So it's like they would like graphics, but they don't want to spend a lot of time. It sounded like, thinking about it from the start. Weird.
There's a question in the chat right now about accessibility in design, which is a really interesting one because obviously the control that you have when you do, like, say, a PDF where you can lay everything out versus putting stuff on a web page where you don't have control over exactly how it's going to be viewed. That plays into accessibility, but what are the other things you think about?
There's color. Let's see, am I echoing again? God, I don't like my voice one time, let alone an echo. Let me try it again. As far as color goes, the most common type of color blindness is red-green, so I always try to avoid that. Then the next is blue-yellow, so there's color. And then the other thing is you never use color as an indicator without something else, a word or a pattern, say on an information graphic.
Yeah, I would kind of sort that into a completely different session, just because,
That's a good point.
You build it, like we run into this a lot. You build interactive content, and so you're building this learning experience, and now all of a sudden you've got accessible considerations, right? Or not all of a sudden, but now you have accessibility considerations. Well, then that completely changes how you approach interactive content. And I think, there's graphic design and visual design and those things and how you communicate. And then, then you have accessibility requirements. Like, well, how do you communicate with other, with people who have different needs? And so I would bench that into a whole different conversation, which might be a good next session. But I think, going back to the conversation about the customer and all that, two things I used to always do. One is I always started with those three legs, right? You've got your content. We're going to work your content over. You need to think about the look and feel of your course. So they're kind of thinking about that as part of the process and project development. They're not just thinking about recycling PowerPoint slides. And then, we want to look at the interactive part. So what are we going to do with this? And then the other thing I do is get them to budget some sort of graphics work into the process. So then it would be, here's what we need. You recommend it. Now, obviously, some places you're lucky if you can get the budget to go out to Starbucks and get a latte. So you don't always get a budget. But, if you start with that and say, these are the things we need to do, and this is what we need to do to support the course, and so we need a budget for graphics. So if it's no budget, then you're stuck doing it yourself and having to scrounge around. But you create the budget, you create the conversation around it, and lo and behold, you tend to get the budgets, and then you can work within the constraints you have with your budgets, whether you hire somebody or buy some assets or whatever you need to do to do your course. But I think starting at the forefront with them thinking about the look and feel of the course and then thinking about how they're going to budget for that, I think is an important part at the beginning of your project.
As far as that question about accessibility, I also think that you have to think about universal design from the start too. It's not something that some courses or some training solutions have and others don't. It's just kind of should be a standard now. So that could be part of what you're talking about, just adding that accessibility to it.
Yeah, I think, that's what we find a lot is people build courses and they want to go back and retrofit it. And at that point, you're going to do a lot of rework.
Right.
Just because you have all these different, things you have to consider in the construction of your course.
Right.
There are some design considerations, though, that are just general good design practices that also have accessibility benefits as well. So leaving white space, empty space in between things, it's good just from a visual design perspective, but for people who have visual impairments, it makes it easier to read. We talk a lot about clean design. Once again, it's nice for everyone, but if you're using a screen reader, that makes it simpler for the screen reader to go through the pieces because there aren't 5,000 different things on the screen. There are some wonderful opportunities where just good design helps everyone.
Right. Sure.
Yeah, okay. Well, I feel like that might really be a nice kind of wrap point on it.
It's a great point.
We're just about the original kind of time we plan to end. First of all, again, thanks to everybody who managed to follow us over here. We're really sincerely sorry about the wonderful and interesting technical difficulties. We had several people working on it, and this is just what it was. But we will still post the recording of this back on the YouTube channel for people to find. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up now, but is there anything, where can we find you? Is there anything you would like to plug? Is there anything you'd like to tell us about that's coming up for our participants? Bianca, is there anything that you would like to tell us about? I'll pick on you first.
Oh, great. I will say this is, if you're looking for some help with finding graphics and tools and you don't have a lot of budget, Tracy and I both collect just all sorts of things that we find online of free tools. I do free design resources on Pinterest. I can flip the link out to Julie and Tracy to put in the show notes.
That'd be good.
But something that I find really helpful is leveraging Pinterest and either putting together examples of things I think are really well designed so I can use them for inspiration. And also all of that free design tools, cheap design tools that you bump into over the years. Pinterest is a good place to just keep it all in one place so you can browse it when you need it.
I must have 1,000 color schemes on Pinterest.
But if you're not comfortable with design, my goodness, the best thing out there is to look at what other people are doing that you emotionally respond to. And Pinterest is so great for just collecting all that super easily.
All right. How about you, Connie?
I have a lot of visual design articles at the elearningcoach.com. That's about it for me.
And you have a book. Tell us the title of your book real quick.
It's called Visual Design Solutions. Tracy and I put links out there. It's for learning professionals to learn a little bit about visual design.
All right, great. And Tom?
All right, well, I do the blog. That's probably how most people know me. I'll actually post the link to this week's because I did one on how to create animated GIFs. I saw somebody's asking about animated GIFs, so I got that, and then you got the blog link in there. If you're interested, we do the workshops, even though they're articulate. We do a lot of general content too. So if you go to the blog, I think we're going to be in Toronto, Seattle, and Minneapolis, and Halifax if you're in Halifax. So we'll be there, and that design mapping is always one of the activities we do there. So it's a good time. So if you're an Articulate user, we welcome you. Come join us. They're always kind of fun to do. I think some of you, I think Julie, you helped out one time, and Tracy, you've been there. So that's what we'll be doing. And I'm always in the community at Articulate, so if you have questions, you can always jump in there and ask as well. Yeah,
and I would say that Tom's blog in the Articulate community, even if you're not an Articulate user, is a great place to get resources on all of this kind of stuff: visual design, instructional design, ways to think about e-learning interactivity. It's just a really delightful resource, whether you're an Articulate user or not.
Yeah.
So,
thanks.
Tracy, how about you?
So I'll tie everyone together here. So Tom is coming to Toronto for the Articulate Roadshow June 3rd and 4th. Connie is coming to Toronto for the Canadian e-learning conference. She is our keynote, and that's July 18th and 19th. We'll put a link in for that as well. And Bianca is from Toronto. So we all tie together here. So those are a couple of events that I will be at as well. You can catch me there. We also have just launched our website. So we've got nerdyshoptalk.com, where we will have links to the shows, and we will have links to the show notes. So any of the links that were posted in the chat today, we'll have them there. Other things that were referenced, how to get in contact with our guests, will all be there as well. And Julie, where can we find you?
So I am either at Usable Learning, which is my sort of general website for consulting and work. And then also I have a new site called designbetterlearning.com, where I'm doing online courses, and I have one on sticky learning, so design for attention and engagement. And we do talk about visual design a little bit in there in terms of how it plays in with those kinds of things.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you everyone for this. Our next talk is coming up in June, so stay tuned for that. We'll be posting that out shortly. The date, when that will be, it'll be early June. We're just nailing down the time and our guests, and we will get back to you with what that is.
Cool.
Yeah, it's going to be related to games because Carl Kapp's going to come talk to us, but we're narrowing down the description and questions and things like that. So that will be coming up. But thank you so much for all of our guests today, and thanks to everybody who made it over to Zoom. Well done. And yes, we appreciate you having you all here.
Great.
Thank you
you,
so much.
Everyone.
Thanks.